What if I told you that one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century believed that Jews and Arabs could live together in peace, within the same state? That this philosopher not only dreamed of such a reality, but dedicated decades of his life trying to make it possible? It sounds impossible, doesn't it? Especially when we look at today's headlines. Gaza, the West Bank, rockets, attacks, protests, hatred passed down from generation to generation. The conflict in the Middle East seems like a wound that never heals, an equation without a solution, a maze with no way out. But there was a time, not so long ago, when a voice rose up amid the chaos proposing something revolutionary. Dialogue. Not as a political strategy, not as a diplomatic tactic, but as a philosophy of life. An approach that saw in the other not an enemy to be defeated, but a human being to be understood. This was Martin Buber's dream, a dream that today almost no one remembers. Buber was not a naive dreamer lost in impossible utopias. He was a respected intellectual, a university professor, and author of works that influenced generations of thinkers. But his greatest boldness was not in the books he wrote. It was in the life he chose to live and the ideas he had the courage to defend, even when it put him at odds with his own compatriots. Imagine for a moment, in the 1940s, when the world was still processing the horrors of the Holocaust and the state of Israel was being born amid war, a Jewish philosopher stood up to say that the solution was not separation, but union, that Jews and Arabs should build together a nation where both would be equal citizens, equally respected, equally owners of the land they shared. Sounds crazy? Maybe. But this madness was based on one of the deepest and most humane philosophies ever developed about what it truly means to relate to the other. Buber was not just talking about politics, he was talking about a revolution in how human beings see and treat each other. Today, when the world seems more polarized than ever, when social media amplifies hatred and fear of the different, when ethnic and religious conflicts explode on every continent, maybe it's time to revisit this forgotten dream. Not because it is easy to implement, on the contrary, it is terribly difficult, but because it offers us an alternative to the endless cycle of vengeance and retaliation that seems to be our only response to conflict. Martin Buber's story is also the story of a lost opportunity. A window briefly opened in history and then closed by circumstances, fear, and the urgency of events. But ideas do not die with lost opportunities. They wait silently until someone has the courage to rescue them. This is not a video about politics. I am not going to tell you who is right or wrong in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is a video about philosophy applied to real life, about a man who believed it was possible to transform enemies into neighbors through the power of genuine dialogue. It is about the question Buber asked himself, and that still echoes today. Is our shared humanity stronger than our differences? Can we learn to see the other not as a threat, but as someone who also seeks dignity, security, and peace? Buber's answer was a categorical yes, and he spent his whole life trying to prove that this yes was possible. But who was this man? Who dared to dream the impossible? Where did this radical vision of coexistence come from in an era marked by extreme nationalism and ethnic hatred? To understand his revolutionary ideas, we first need to know the man behind them. Martin Mordecai Buber was born on February 8, 1878 in Vienna, a city alive with transformation. It was the height of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a melting pot of cultures, languages, and traditions mixing in the streets, cafes, and universities. Perhaps it was precisely this multicultural environment that planted the seed of tolerance and fascination with dialogue between differences in Buber from an early age. But his childhood was not easy. When he was only 3 years old, his parents separated, something scandalous at the time, and little Martin was sent to live with his paternal grandparents in Lemberg, Galicia. This maternal abandonment would deeply mark his life and, interestingly, his philosophy. Years later, Buber would say it was in this experience of rupture and loss that he began to understand the vital importance of authentic human relationships. Buber's grandparents were fascinating figures. His grandfather, Salomon Buber, was a respected scholar, an expert in ancient Jewish literature. He was the one who introduced his grandson to the rich and complex world of Jewish tradition, not only as a religion, but as a living culture, full of stories, debates, and questions. His grandmother, Adele, was a cultured and independent woman who spoke several languages and had an impressive library. In that house, young Martin grew up breathing knowledge and intellectual diversity. But another element of his upbringing would become crucial: contact with Hasidism. Hasidism is a mystical stream of Judaism that emphasizes direct experience of the divine, joy in faith, and the importance of warm human relationships. For Hasidim, God is not only in sacred books or formal rituals. He is in genuine encounters between people, in everyday kindness, in love of neighbor. This vision enchanted Buber. Here was a spirituality that did not separate the sacred from the profane, that saw in human relationships a form of connection with the divine. Years later, this Hasidic influence would permeate his entire philosophy, transforming into the idea that every genuine encounter between two people is a sacred event. At 18, Buber went to study in Berlin, immersing himself in the world of German philosophy. It was an effervescent time for European thought. Nietzsche questioned traditional values, Freud explored the unconscious, Einstein revolutionized physics. Buber absorbed it all but always kept his feet firmly planted in the Jewish tradition that shaped him. During his university years, Buber became involved with the emerging Zionist movement. But from the start, his approach was different from most. While many Zionists focused on the urgency of creating a Jewish state as a response to European anti-Semitism, Buber was more interested in what he called the Jewish cultural renaissance. For him, the important thing was not just to have territory but to revitalize Jewish culture and values. In 1904, already graduated and married to Paula Winkler, a non-Jewish writer who converted to Judaism, Buber began working as an editor and writer. It was during this time that he published his first works on Hasidism, revealing to the Western world the richness of this mystical tradition. His books on Hasidic tales became bestsellers, introducing a broad audience to a side of Judaism very different from the stereotypical image that prevailed in Europe. But Buber was not merely an academic. He believed that philosophy should be lived, not just thought. During World War I, he worked with Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe, witnessing firsthand the suffering caused by extreme nationalism. These experiences only reinforced his conviction that the path to peace did not lie in the separation of peoples, but in learning to live together. The turning point came in the 1920s and 1930s. Anti-Semitism was growing in Europe, Nazism was gaining strength in Germany, and many Jews began migrating to Palestine. Buber, already in his 50s, made a decision that would change his life. He would leave Europe and move to Jerusalem. But he was not merely fleeing persecution. He was going with a mission: to build a different kind of society in the Holy Land, a society based on dialogue and coexistence. It was 1938 when Buber arrived in Jerusalem to take up a professorship at the Hebrew University. He brought with him not only his books and belongings, but a revolutionary vision of what the new Jewish homeland could become. It was time to turn philosophy into reality. But how could that be done in a land already divided by conflict? The answer to that question lay at the heart of the philosophy Buber had been developing for decades: the revolutionary distinction between two fundamentally different ways of relating to the world and to other people. In 1923, he had published his masterpiece I and Thou, a small book in size but enormous in its implications. For Buber, there are only two basic ways for a human being to relate to anything or anyone: the I-thou relationship and the I-it relationship. It may sound simple, but this distinction would forever change the way we understand human relationships, politics, and even our connection to the divine. Let's start with the I-it relationship. This is the most common way we relate to the world, and unfortunately to people as well. When you look at a chair, you see it as an object, something to sit on, with a certain color, height, and material. The chair exists to serve your purposes. You analyze it, categorize it, use it. It's a relationship between a subject, you, and an object, the chair. The problem arises when we treat people the same way. When you see someone primarily by their function, my boss, the salesman, that Arab, that Jew, you have established an I-it relationship. The person becomes an object in your experience, defined by categories, stereotypes, or utilities. You may even like them, but they are not truly present to you as a unique and complex human being. The I-thou relationship, on the other hand, is something entirely different. It happens when you truly encounter another person, not as a function, a category, or a means to an end, but as a living, unique, mysterious presence. In this encounter, there is no prior analysis or judgment. There is only openness, mutual recognition, genuine presence. Buber was not speaking of sentimentality or naivety. The I-thou relationship is intense and demanding. It requires you to temporarily let go of your defenses, your prejudices, your agendas. It demands that you become vulnerable enough to be transformed by the encounter. Because in a true I-thou meeting, both people emerge changed from who they were before. Think of the difference between knowing someone through their LinkedIn resume versus having a deep conversation with them about their fears, dreams, and significant experiences. In the first case, you have information about them, an I-it relationship. In the second, you meet them as a whole person, an I-thou relationship. But here comes Buber's revolutionary insight. We cannot live permanently in the I-thou relationship. It would be exhausting and impractical. We need I-it relationships to function in the world, to work, study, organize our practical lives. The problem is not having I-it relationships, but when they become our only way of relating, especially to other people. The modern world, Buber observed, was increasingly dominated by the logic of I-it. People were seen primarily as human resources, consumers, voters, statistics. Technology and bureaucracy amplified this trend, reducing human encounters to efficient transactions. Even within families, people often related more through roles, the father, the daughter, than as unique human beings. This analysis applied directly to political and ethnic conflicts. When Jews see Arabs only as enemies or terrorists, and when Arabs see Jews only as colonizers or oppressors, both have established I-it relationships. The other becomes a category, a stereotype, an abstract threat. The specific, unique, and complex humanity of each person vanishes behind the labels. For Buber, this was the root of all major human conflicts, the inability or refusal to see the other as a thou, as a full human being, worthy of recognition and respect, capable of surprise and change. As long as we remain trapped in the logic of I-it, in our relationships with different groups, peace is impossible. But how do we transform enemies into thou? How do we break the cycle of mutual objectification that fuels conflict? Buber's answer was not simple, but it was clear, through genuine dialogue. Not the kind of dialogue that is really a disguised monologue, where each person just waits their turn to speak and repeat fixed positions. Buber spoke of a dialogue in which you truly listen to the other, where you allow yourself to be questioned and even changed by what you hear. This authentic dialogue requires three essential elements. First, you must be genuinely present, not thinking about your next meeting or your planned response. Second, you must practice what Buber called inclusion, the ability to see the situation also through the other's eyes, without abandoning your own point of view. Third, you must accept the other as a legitimate partner in dialogue, someone who has something valid to contribute. It sounds obvious, but in practice, it's extraordinarily difficult. It requires us to temporarily give up our need to be right, our tendency to categorize the other into comfortable boxes, our desire to win the argument. It requires intellectual humility and emotional courage. Buber was not suggesting that we should agree with everyone or passively accept any behavior. He was himself a fierce critic of Nazism and all forms of oppression. But he argued that even in disagreement, even in conflict, we can choose to see the other as a thou, as someone whose humanity must be recognized, even when their actions must be opposed. This philosophy was not just academic theory for Buber. It was a way of life, a form of resistance against the dehumanization he saw growing around him. And when he arrived in Palestine, he was determined to apply these principles to the most complex and volatile situation of his time, the relationship between Jews and Arabs in the Holy Land. But how exactly did he intend to do this? How could a philosophy of personal encounter become a viable political proposal for two conflicting peoples? Buber was not alone. His vision attracted a significant group of intellectuals and activists who shared his concerns. In 1925, they founded the organization Brit Shalom, Covenant of Peace, dedicated to promoting understanding between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. The group included impressive figures: Judah Magnus, Chancellor of the Hebrew University; Henrietta Schold, founder of Hadassah; Arthur Ruppin, sociologist and urban planner; Gershom Scholem, a great scholar of Jewish mysticism. They were not marginal utopians. They were some of the brightest minds in the Zionist movement. What united them was the conviction that Zionism was losing its moral soul. They had come to Palestine inspired by the prophetic Jewish ideals of justice and peace, but saw the movement turning into yet another form of aggressive ethnic nationalism. Buber's approach was deeply practical. He proposed starting small, creating kibbutzim, agricultural communities that included both Jews and Arabs, establishing bilingual schools, developing joint economic projects, forming interfaith dialogue groups. The idea was to demonstrate, through concrete examples, that coexistence was not only possible but mutually beneficial. "We cannot impose peace through grand political declarations," Buber said. "Peace grows from the ground up, through genuine relationships between real people." He saw the Jewish-Arab conflict not as inevitable, but as the result of specific political choices that could be changed. Both peoples had come to Palestine fleeing persecution, the Jews from European anti-Semitism, many Arabs from poverty and oppression elsewhere in the Middle East. Both had legitimate historical ties to the land. Both deserved dignity and security. Key problem for Buber was not the simultaneous presence of two peoples in the same land, but the insistence that only one of them could truly own it. This zero-sum logic, either us or them, was what made the conflict seem unsolvable. But what if there was a third way? What if, instead of dividing the land or establishing one group's domination over the other, Jews and Arabs could build something new together, a binational society in which both were equal citizens, equally responsible, equally benefited? It was a radical idea, perhaps too radical for its time. But Buber was convinced it was the only morally acceptable alternative, and the only one that could truly work in the long term. For Martin Buber, the boundary between faith and politics was never rigid. Unlike those who viewed spirituality as a private and inner experience separate from the practical issues of the world, he firmly asserted, true faith requires action. For him, the relationship with the divine, this I-thou relationship, does not end in the temple or in silent meditation. It must be manifested in the concrete world, in encounters with others, in ethical decisions in the face of injustice. This engaged spirituality led Buber to become deeply involved in political debates, not just as a thinker, but as an activist. But be aware, he was not a politician in the conventional sense. He refused positions, parties, and acronyms. What he did was deeper. He injected soul into social debates, calling both leaders and crowds to moral responsibility, not just strategy. His involvement in the context of Palestine and the building of the State of Israel was marked by this spirit. He became one of the main voices advocating for dialogue between Jews and Arabs, tirelessly seeking to build bridges where most saw only walls. In 1925, Buber helped found a remarkable initiative, Brit Shalom, Covenant of Peace, a group of Jewish intellectuals openly advocating for the creation of a binational state in Palestine, a shared home for Jews and Arabs, where both peoples would have equal rights and responsibilities. This proposal, though a minority view, had a deeply philosophical and spiritual foundation, the refusal of domination. For the members of Brit Shalom, it was not enough to found a Jewish state. It had to be founded justly.
However, it is clear that the challenge is immense. The wounds of the past, the memories of violence, the opposing narratives, and the interference of external powers. All of these make the dream very difficult to realize. But precisely because
of this, Buber's proposal remains relevant. It reminds us that lasting peace is not built only with walls, armies, or cold negotiations. It is necessary to create conditions for dialogue to flourish. And for that, courage and a profound shift in mindset are required. Moreover, the binational dream is a reminder of the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is not a problem that can be resolved through simplistic or Manichaean political solutions. It demands sensitivity, patience, and a willingness to see the other as a person, not as an enemy. Ultimately, Buber's legacy challenges us to ask, have we not lost something valuable by rejecting proposals like this? Has the path of segregation and exclusion not led us further away from a real possibility of peace? These questions remain open, and they are precisely what makes Buber's philosophy a powerful tool for both the present and the future. Martin Buber passed away in 1965, but his thinking and his proposals are still very much alive, especially in a world facing increasingly complex and polarized conflicts. In the 21st century, in the midst of globalization and digital technologies, Buber's philosophy and his binational vision are more relevant than ever. How can the thinking of a philosopher from the last century help us understand, and perhaps transform, the Israeli-Palestinian crisis today? What are the current developments of Buber's legacy, and where can his influence be seen? To begin with, it's important to note that Buber's philosophy of dialogue has been adopted and reinterpreted in various fields, from education to politics, from psychology to theology. His basic principle, that the authentic encounter between people is the foundation of true humanity, resonates in contemporary initiatives for conflict resolution and peace-building. In the Israeli-Palestinian issue, inter-community dialogue, groups, non-governmental organizations, and social movements aim to put into practice what Buber advocated: meeting the other as a subject, building bridges, and overcoming the cycle of violence and mistrust. These initiatives, often difficult and controversial, represent concrete attempts to revitalize the binational dream of coexistence, though on a limited and local scale. They show that Buber's idea is not just a distant utopia, but a possible project when there is political and social will. Furthermore, Buber's thought has influenced leaders and intellectuals dedicated to peace in the Middle East. The philosophy of dialogue helps explain the importance of listening to the other, recognizing their narratives and pains, and seeking a solution that is not imposed but built together. In academia, Buber is studied as a pioneer of dialogical philosophy and relational ethics. His work inspires those who believe that conflict can only be overcome through the transformation of human relationships, not merely political structures. However, the reality of the conflict remains harsh. Tensions, walls, blockades, and wars seem far removed from the ideal of coexistence that Buber advocated. For this reason, many critics claim that his proposal was naive or impossible. But such criticism does not invalidate the value of Buber's legacy. On the contrary, it reinforces the need to look beyond immediacy and superficial solutions. True, peace, as Buber knew, requires time, dedication, and a profound change in the way we think and act. One of the most interesting aspects of Buber's legacy in the 21st century is its connection with human rights and the idea of cultural pluralism. He anticipated concepts that are now central to global debate: the importance of diversity, the recognition of the other, and the rejection of totalitarianism, whether nationalist, religious, or ideological. That is why Buber's philosophy also resonates in other contexts of conflict and exclusion, demonstrating its universal reach. Whether in ethnic, cultural, or political disputes, the I-thou approach proposes a path that humanizes dialogue and builds bridges. In practice, this translates into efforts to create safe spaces for listening and understanding, where people can recognize each other beyond the identity categories that so often divide them. In Israel and Palestine, this means promoting encounters between communities, encouraging education for peace, and supporting initiatives that pursue social justice. It is also worth noting that Buber's work has gained new interpretations in the digital age. Social networks and online platforms, although they often amplify conflict and polarization, also offer unprecedented possibilities for dialogue and connection. For example, projects that connect young people from Israeli and Palestinian communities to discuss their dreams and realities are inspired by the idea that human contact can break down barriers and prejudices. However, these paths are fragile and require a great deal of work. Buber's legacy is therefore a constant call for vigilance and commitment to peace, a reminder that dialogue is not a given, but a daily achievement. Another important contribution of Buber's legacy is its impact on contemporary spirituality. His philosophical approach blends traditional Jewish elements with an open humanism that values the experience of encounter as sacred. This spiritual vision, which sees the thou as a living and transformative presence, inspires movements that seek to integrate religion and politics in an ethical and peaceful way. In the 21st century, when religious extremism often fuels conflict, Buber's philosophy presents an alternative that respects faith but rejects fanaticism. Finally, it is important to emphasize that Martin Buber's legacy is an invitation for everyone, not only Israelis and Palestinians, but for anyone seeking a more just and humane world. His philosophy challenges us to look at the other with genuine respect, to reject the language of hatred, and to build in our everyday lives the foundations for peaceful coexistence. And despite the challenges, this is a message of hope. Dialogue, as Buber taught, is the key to transforming conflict into opportunity and separation into encounter. Thus, as we look toward the 21st century, we see that Martin Buber's dream is far from being a relic of the past. It is a living inspiration, a light guiding those who believe in the possibility of peace, even in the places where it seems most difficult. Martin Buber's philosophy of dialogue is not just an abstract theory, it is a practical invitation to transform human relationships, especially in contexts of conflict such as that between Israelis and Palestinians. In this chapter, we will explore how the I-thou can be understood as a powerful tool for building peace and overcoming the divisions that feed the cycle of violence. At the core of Buber's philosophy is the idea that authentic encounters between people occur when we relate to the other as a thou, that is, as a whole person with voice, history, and dignity. This kind of relationship breaks away from the utilitarian or instrumental view, in which the other is seen merely as a means to an end, an object to be manipulated. Applying this philosophy to the reality of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict means, first and foremost, recognizing the full humanity of each side in all its complexity. It implies listening to the other's narratives, pains, fears, and hopes, without reducing their experience to a stereotype or enemy. For Buber, dialogue is not simply a conversation. It is a deep encounter that transforms both participants, because in that moment, they recognize and respect each other. This transformation is what makes dialogue a real path to peace, not just a formal diplomatic exercise. Of course, this ideal faces many challenges. In environments marked by decades of conflict, mistrust is high and the wounds are still open. Fear, prejudice, and trauma hinder genuine encounter. That is why dialogue requires courage, the courage to listen without judgment, to speak honestly, and to admit mistakes and vulnerabilities. Moreover, dialogue demands a commitment to justice. For Buber, true peace cannot exist unless conditions of equality and respect are guaranteed. It is not merely about peaceful coexistence, but about living together based on social justice and the recognition of everyone's rights. In practice, this means that dialogue must be accompanied by concrete actions, policies that promote equality, educational initiatives that teach empathy, and cultural programs that bring communities closer together. Some contemporary experiences show that the philosophy of dialogue can be successfully applied. Mixed groups of Israelis and Palestinians have worked together on social, cultural, and educational projects, seeking to build relationships of trust and cooperation. These initiatives are small, often invisible to mainstream media, but they represent important seeds for sustainable peace. They show that even amid conflict, it is possible to cultivate spaces where the I-thou relationship can flourish. Another fundamental aspect of the philosophy of dialogue is the recognition of otherness, the acceptance that the other is different, and that this difference should not be erased but valued. This view promotes a pluralism that rejects the imposition of a single identity and embraces diversity as a form of richness. In the Israeli-Palestinian context, this means respecting the cultural, religious, and historical identities of both peoples without trying to erase one in favor of the other. Ultimately, the philosophy of dialogue invites hope and patience. Buber recognized that the process of building peace is long and difficult, full of setbacks and contradictions. But he insisted that dialogue is the only possible path to transform conflict into coexistence. By adopting this perspective, we leave behind the terrain of hopelessness and fatalism and enter the field of ethical action and human commitment. This is Martin Buber's great contribution to the present, to show us that no matter how difficult the challenges may be, peace is possible when we choose to see the other as a thou, a partner in dialogue and in humanity. In a world marked by growing divisions where dialogue often seems impossible, reclaiming Martin Buber's vision is more than a philosophical exercise. It is an urgent necessity. This chapter explores why, especially today, Buber's proposal must be remembered, discussed, and put into practice. Global polarization, identity crises, and the rise of hate speech highlight the failure of traditional forms of coexistence and political negotiation. In the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains one of the most complex and persistent on the planet, fueled by decades of mistrust, violence, and injustice. In this context, Buber's binational vision, grounded in dialogue and mutual recognition, may seem like a distant ideal, even naive to some. But it is precisely this vision that offers an alternative path to break the vicious cycle of conflict. To reclaim Buber today is, first and foremost, to remember that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the active construction of relationships based on respect, justice, and human dignity. It is an invitation to transcend exclusivist narratives and embrace plural coexistence. This also means questioning policies that perpetuate segregation, apartheid, and inequality. Buber's vision calls for the building of social and political structures that guarantee equal rights, respect for differences, and opportunities for all. In the cultural and educational sphere, reclaiming Buber's vision means investing in the formation of a new generation capable of seeing the other not as an enemy, but as a partner in dialogue and mutual growth. Educational projects that promote empathy and critical thinking are essential to lay the foundations for this transformation. Moreover, in the digital age, where fake news, hate speech, and polarization spread rapidly, the philosophy of dialogue offers tools to resist the dehumanization of the other. It reinforces the importance of listening, questioning, and seeking truth through direct and respectful encounters. Another crucial point is that Buber's vision transcends the specific conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. It inspires peace and social justice movements around the world, showing that the path of dialogue is universal and necessary in any conflict situation. By reclaiming Buber, communities, leaders, and individuals align themselves with a philosophical tradition that values the human being in their entirety and recognizes the transformative power of authentic encounters. Finally, the importance of reviving this vision lies in the hope it offers. In times of crisis, when pessimism prevails, remembering Buber's dream is to rekindle the belief that peace is possible, not as an idealized endpoint, but as a continuous and collective process. It is a message that challenges us to act, to not remain passive in the face of violence and injustice, but to work tirelessly toward building a future where Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians can finally live together in peace. We have reached the end of this journey through Martin Buber's thought and his vision for a different future for Israel and the entire Middle East. Throughout this text, we have seen how the Jewish philosopher courageously and humanely defended the idea of genuine dialogue between historically divided peoples, especially between Jews and Arabs. The conclusion we must draw is that Buber's legacy remains more alive than ever, not as an unattainable utopia, but as an urgent ethical call to all who desire a more just and peaceful world. His I-thou philosophy reminds us that to transform conflict, we must first transform the way we relate to the other, no longer as an adversary to be eliminated, but as a conversation partner, a subject with their own dignity and history. In a world where extremes seem to dominate, where radical voices try to silence dialogue, Buber's message is a light that invites us to resist dehumanization, polarization, and hatred. The history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is complex, painful, and marked by injustices. But it is precisely because of this complexity that we need responses that go beyond traditional political pragmatism. We need an approach that values humanity in its fullness and places dialogue at the center of peace-building. Moreover, Buber's legacy serves as a reminder that the path to peace requires time, patience, and commitment. There is no magic or quick solution. The process is gradual, sometimes difficult, and needs the active involvement of everyone, leaders, communities, and individuals alike. As spectators and global citizens, we can carry this message into our own lives. We can cultivate the I-thou in our daily relationships, seeking empathy, attentive listening, and genuine respect for the other. And in the broader context, we can support initiatives that promote dialogue, justice, and equality through education, activism, or simply through honest and open exchange of ideas. Finally, I leave you with a question to reflect on. What role are you willing to play in this search for peace and understanding? Is there still room for Martin Buber's dream in today's world? And more importantly, how can we turn that dream into reality? May this reflection not end here, but be transformed into action, into dialogue, and above all, into hope. Thank you for joining this journey. May Martin Buber's thought inspire many paths of peace and understanding. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content exploring history, philosophy, and messages of hope for the future, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave a like to help strengthen this community and show that we want more videos like this. And share it with your friends and family. The more people who learn about Martin Buber's inspiring vision and the importance of dialogue, the better for all of us. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.